Jeremiah chapters 41 to 52 today, and that will finish off the book of Jeremiah. We're also going to do a quick summary on it because the summary is pretty straightforward for this, I think. It seems reasonable to say. We open this with a chap called Gedaliah, I'm not quite sure, but he is appointed as the governor by the Babylonians to go and look after the Israelites who still live in Judah. This is an interesting thing that's emerged in this latter half of Jeremiah, because it wasn't clear before that there were any Israelites left in Judah at all. But it turns out that is the case, and they're given this governor. We're then introduced to a chap called Ishmael, who is an Israelite, and he seems to have some sort of getting along with the governor, this chap, but then betrays and kills him. He then kills a load of his fellow Israelites, and then there's 80 people he kills from Shechem, Shiloh and Samaria, and just throws them into a big hole. Bit weird. Actually, that's not quite true. 10 of them he decides to spare because they say, no, we've got wheat and honey and it's out in a field somewhere, so let us go. And he does. Clearly not enough detail in that part of the story in terms of what's going on and why. Doesn't seem to make a great deal of sense. But Ishmael, either way, we don't like him very much at all. We then meet a chap called Johannahan, who is another Israelite, and he goes after Ishmael to go and hold him to account for all this stuff he's done. But Ishmael just disappears and ends up living with the Ammonites or something like that. And I don't quite know. We don't seem to see what happens to him after that. Johannahan, it's hard to remember that one. He then gets together the rest of the Israelites who are living in Judah and decides he's going to take them to Egypt where they'll be safe. If you recall, it's been mentioned previously in this, though, and in Isaiah, that people were going to think they wanted to go to Egypt or Assyria, and it wasn't going to work. But Johannahan comes to Jeremiah and says, what should we do? Ask God what we should do and tell us. And even if we don't like what he says, we will do as we're told. So Jeremiah says, understandably, don't go to Egypt. Does also say, though, just stay here and everything will be cool. It'll be all right, which is not what I expected at all. But Johannahan decides that, no, you're lying. So I'm not going to do that at all, and I'm going to go to Egypt. Despite the fact he just said to Jeremiah, I'll do whatever you say God says we should do, even if that's something we don't want to do. So Johannahan, clearly an idiot. So Ishmael punk, Johannahan idiot, Gedaliah dead. It seems almost that then it's because of Johannahan and the other Israelites going to Egypt that God gets the Egyptians to come and whack Egypt. No, God gets the Babylonians to come and whack the Egyptians. So, it's not clear that maybe that was going to happen anyway. But it's really odd in the sense that Egypt then gets whacked by the Babylonians, and it's sort of framed as it being because of Johannahan going there. And so that goes pretty badly. Interesting though, we now have reference to Pharaoh Hophra, which who you can look him up. He's literally a dude who's documented in Egyptian history, and dates to his reign was 589 to 570 BC. It's really interesting how the history here all suddenly starts to tie together. And it's, I guess, as soon as you involve Babylonians and Egyptians, perhaps to some extent. But that's interesting now to hear about who the Egyptian pharaoh is, because all the previous references, and certainly in Exodus, there was no name to the pharaoh at all. It was just Pharaoh. And I talked previously about, you can see how there could be an angle on why they might not know what the pharaoh's name was. Potentially. I'm guessing there's no internet or anything, was there? So, but now clearly they do. Later on as well, we have a reference to a Pharaoh Necho as well, Necho, something like that. So, the history becomes pretty solid at this sort of, insofar as anything 2,000 or 2,500 years ago is solid, but, it's interesting. As a bit of a tangent point, there's this mention in chapter 46, verse 1, where it says, "This is the word of the Lord," and carries on to say, which came to Jeremiah. And it's interesting because as mentioned before, I've been dabbling with a little bit of church, and every week they do a reading, and there's someone will read something from the Bible, and quite often it seems to be down to personal choice, but most people will end it with, "This is the word of the Lord," and the whole congregation goes, "Thanks be to God," in a really sort of insincere sounding kind of, "Thanks be to God." You say, thanks, you think it'd be exciting, but I guess that's one of the challenges of church. Part of me really likes it and thinks it's brilliant. Part of me just, it's a struggle. But anyway, that's interesting that they say that. And of course, in this context, that is true, because what it then goes on to relate is literally what God said to Jeremiah, to the extent that it's true. But in the church bits, they will read, "This is the word of the Lord," after anything. So, I mean, you could have been reading an excerpt from Job, for example. And as we know, some of the stuff in Job's friends are saying stuff which God later says, no, that wasn't right. So in theory, you could be reading out a passage from the book of Job and then say, "This is the word of the Lord." It's like, well, it isn't, is it? And it goes back to some extent to the tangent I did. Misquoting Jesus, that was it. And that we were looking at the reliability of the Bible. And my feeling was that the Bible's solid, but I don't think you can say that it is the inspired word of God or whatever it is. So the whole "this is the word of the Lord" thing applied in the church context, I don't feel like that works. If I ever did a reading, which I can't see it being on the cards, but if I ever did, I definitely would not be saying "this is the word of the Lord" afterwards. That just doesn't seem a reasonable claim. Sort of slight tangent point there, but on we go. We have a sort of a softer clarification, because there's been a lot of clarification throughout the book of Jeremiah about why this is all happening. And we have, it's pretty bleak, but then we have a sort of a nicer version where God is saying to Judah, I'm going to discipline you. So it's not, I'm just going to come and whack you. It is a discipline thing, which has a sort of a positive connotation of trying to straighten out, doesn't it? And he says, but it'll only be in due measure, and it will not be a total destruction. But he does say, I will not let you go entirely unpunished. And that's a subtle point, obviously, because they're still getting pretty bad things happening. But it's that shift in tone, isn't it? It's that whole idea of Judges. Is it just one thing after another, God whacking them with stuff? Or is it giving them a chance and they blow it? And it's, again, it's that whole theme. It's all throughout the Old Testament. I think it reads very differently to how it's generally held. We then have the Philistines turn up again. This I've sort of forgotten about them. Not sure they were even about particularly. But they've only turned up in this capacity just to have a big, quite long rant about how they're going to meet their demise because they're terrible. We then have an even longer confirmation section that the same is going to happen to Moab. And there's a sort of a metaphor that Moab is being like an old wine and Babylon is coming to pour out and smash her jars. And just that sort of periodic reminder that God really likes to talk in metaphors. He also says, let Moab wallow in her vomit. Like, yeah, great, nice. But it's just this massive rant about how terrible they are and what's coming. Could have been much more efficient. We then have the Ammonites, which presumably take care of Ishmael, because the Ammonites are going to get whacked and Ishmael's with them, so I assume he gets killed. And the Edomites and a load of others, all days numbered ahead. So there's just these sections of rantage about what's going to happen to them all. The biggest one, though, interestingly, whole of chapters 50 and 51, is about the demise of the Babylonians. And it's that really interesting idea that God is using the Babylonians to deal with all these other people. But it's not saying, like, you guys are great, you go and do that. It's like, you guys are awful, I'm going to get you to do that, and then you're going as well. So yeah, the longest section of all in terms of despicableness is directed at the Babylonians. Interesting as well, it doesn't say it's the Persians coming to do that, but I guess that doesn't really matter. But yeah, so as an overall summary for the whole book of Jeremiah, it's in the prophet section, so obviously there's prophetic things, but there's not much prophecy that's new on top of Isaiah. So actually, I think the more interesting thing of Jeremiah has been the history, actually. It's just added in some extra context that I hadn't picked up before. Maybe it was there and I just missed it, but seemingly not. There's also the fact it's extremely long-winded. It's one of the biggest books, or potentially, I think if you the word count in Hebrew or something makes it the longest book in the Bible. And that's 5 videos to cover that, whereas Genesis is shorter, and we had 12 videos on that, and Isaiah is shorter, and we had 15 videos on that. Jeremiah, just lots and lots of long-winded stuff with not as information dense, I suppose. Yeah, but the next book is written by Jeremiah as well, so we'll go and see. He's got a little bit more to say. It's going to be a little bit long-winded, so we'll shorten that into a nice compact thing for you. But yeah, good fun, and on to the next one.